But alongside that, I'm doing my PhD, as you know, and my PhD is focusing on AI in education. But the biggest hurdle, even if we have fantastic product, is going to be number one. It definitely seems like they have started to really innovate a way where we can see what the future of education might look like in a few years. Where do we go from here? What is the next step for teachers, especially the teacher that doesn't have a school that's innovative? And I think that's where the magic is going to be. It's in that small space of that's an amazing saying. That is so accurate, and I think therein lies the problem because AI is a psychological shift before it's a technological one.
Okay, Ivan, you are based in Qatar, if I've got the pronunciation correct. Yet
I'm based
you
in
are,
Qatar, yes.
yeah, but you are a South African boy. So tell us a bit where do you come from? You know, your roots in South Africa. I think that's a very interesting development in the conversation. You know, based up in the Middle East, but yet you are from just around the corner from where I am.
Yes, well, that's definitely correct. I mean, I was born in Pretoria, lived the majority of my life in Pretoria. I moved to the Western Cape at, I think it was about some point, 2017 maybe, just before I made my way to the Middle East. So my background is predominantly in psychology, and that's how I started my journey into education. So I started as a school counselor, and I weaved my way into education, going into special educational needs. Then I studied further in the UK. I became a Senko in a school in the Middle East, in here in Qatar. And then I went back to South Africa as a principal of a school at the British Academy in Brooklyn. Was fantastic. It's a really amazing school, to be honest with you. I really enjoyed my time there. And then I made my way back into the Middle East right now. So,
Mm,
I mean, that's very much a snapshot.
mm,
And
mm,
I think what also brings us together today is obviously talking about education, but also talking about the future of education. So,
mm,
alongside my work currently I'm a co-founder of a company called Pinnacle International. It's a
mhm,
Qatar-based educational consultancy firm. So we work with schools across the entire region, looking at leadership development, school improvement, inclusion strategy, because of course that's a big passion of mine is looking at special educational need and how we can
mm.
help. And we also have a higher education college. So that's kind of like very briefly what we do. But alongside that, I'm doing my PhD, as you know, and my PhD is focusing on AI in education, indeed.
So I don't know if you want to take it from Pinnacle towards AI or from AI towards Pinnacle, or there's just a general overlap. But as you know from my side, you know, we're hosting this podcast to get the word out, to speak about AI in education. My personal experience is a lot of teachers would be using your normal large language model, you know, the free versions of ChatGPT and Claude and Grok and so forth. But when you talk about AI in education, what I have found is the topic that generally is left out. You know, it's almost like we don't talk about it because we don't have a solution for it yet. Is how do you actually get AI to be an educator, to teach? So, is there anything from that perspective? I've got a couple of questions that I want to work through with you, you know, on this topic, but just to get the conversation going from your perspective as a psychologist, special needs, inclusive education, how do we address AI, which is an abundant resource? I mean, it really is an abundant resource. I sometimes use the analogy that we have got a million PhD graduates. So we have got PhD graduates. They are the most clever people on earth, millions of them. They know everything, they can do everything, and they're standing outside the front door knocking and saying, "We are here. We want to work for you. Tell us what to do." And that's where I'm standing. That's my perspective on AI in education is how do we get the message out that it can be scaled? So please feel free, your perspectives.
I mean, it's a really good question, and you asked whether I want to bridge from the PhD side or my academic background, or whether I want to bridge from Pinnacle. But it's very interchangeable for me, but through Pinnacle, of course, what we do is we try to really help schools build confidence first. And I think the answer is the same. We have to help schools build confidence first. And how do we do that? Because ultimately what we have is the integration of AI in education. The hurdle is not going to be exactly which AI agent to use or which program to use. Yes, that is a hurdle at this very given time, but the biggest hurdle, even if we have fantastic product, is going to be number one, the teacher adaptation, right? Because there's a certain level of anxiety that's going to be, is this going to take away my job? Is this going to replace me? How does this make my life easier? Is it going to make my life harder? And we have to jump that hurdle first, get the teachers confident, because ultimately it's confidence that determines implementation quality. And I think that's definitely the case where we have to figure out how do teachers look at it from their perspective. How do they feel about it, and what do they foresee in the future? And for me, obviously, we go into schools, we help them have a look at how to support their policies, looking at policy and practice, how to help them with their SEN needs. But we also have a look at, okay, how can we guide the AI integration? Is there any current LMSs that they use? How can we help them bridge that gap? I think it's also really relevant to talk about kind of how the majority of educators feel in terms of AI. Let me take it from my perspective, working in also higher education. There was this whole shift towards, okay, now everyone's using ChatGPT to write their master's thesis, for example. And it kind of became demonized, if I can use that term. And then all of a sudden there's a shift back because we start to realize that, look, we can't really stop people from using it. And I think that's also a really important question we need to answer, because I've been in meetings at schools where we meet with the leadership and they say AI is a problem because the students are using it in the homework. How can we prevent students from using it? And my answer to that is we can't prevent it. It's not about prevention, it's about how are we going to get the students to use it responsibly. And that goes the same to the teachers, right? Because you said there's many options, but where do we go from here? What is the next step for teachers, especially the teacher that doesn't have a school that's innovative, especially the teacher that maybe wants to use this or integrate it in some form of way? Which tool do they use? What tool could make it a difference? And I think that's the question. So I think it starts teacher first.
You have said that you started as a school psychologist, which means you've got a lot of experience with the kids, the learners. And then you also deal with teachers, educators. Now, I want to put this on the table for discussion point is, do we need to draw a line, a distinction between people who have already qualified as educators, how they use AI, and the kids who still need to get through school to qualify for whatever, just to get their your national senior certificate in South Africa, we call it. I don't know what else it's called the rest of the world, but your last school here, you qualify for going to university or just basically going out into the work field. Those kids, those children, they still need to learn certain things, whereas the teachers need to learn a new skill. So do we draw a distinction between those two groups when we talk about AI
Yes,
in education?
I think it's a good point. I do think it's a good point. Um, in particular, with the type of curriculum that the student's pursuing, because some curriculums, like let's say the American curriculum, or the IB curriculum, which is predominantly actually a Swedish curriculum. It's European, but a lot of American schools adopt it. It's very holistic, and I think AI can very much easily be integrated in that curriculum to help and assist and help the student develop. But for a curriculum like Cambridge, which almost everything is going to be a summative assessment. and it's going to be a lot of actual academic work, and you have to write a lot. So doing your homework, for example, using ChatGPT is not going to help you, where you sit down and your entire year's work of A level is going to rest on one particular assessment. So I do think it's curriculum dependent, but I also think that you hit the nail on the head when we talk about the skill, because it's also a skill. And I've seen it with teachers, some teachers who use AI, maybe with lesson planning, or use AI to help them with scaffolding, or help them to support special educational needs students. Get some ideas from that. So that's a skill that they are developing. But I do see the distinction between teachers who don't use it at all and teachers who do. Because if you start to develop that skill, definitely you're going to become more effective. And that's across the board. But yes, you are right. I think it's how do we get the students to still develop and master the subjects that they are taking, whilst also responsibly using AI? It's a good question.
You see, but okay, so this draws into the essence of what I'm hoping to air, to get out there is you've got your free versions, technically speaking, you've got your free versions of your AI models, where I can now go as a general person and I can essentially, I saw an article on LinkedIn about this one person who says, am I the only one who think that ChatGPT is a faster Google? So people use it as a better version of search. Search has done, has come and it's basically played its part. I don't really know. I personally don't use Google search anymore, because you can actually search. Yeah, so when you do at tasks, that you just want to do it faster. The large language model seems to be brilliant at that. Whether you just want to quickly write a program, a code, for a website, or whether you want to do a lesson plan as an educator, or whether you wanted to ask it to help you design a proper assessment for your students in whichever subject. You can say to it, listen, this is my Bloom's taxonomy, and this is what I need, and I need 5 questions or 10 questions, and it must be difficult to easy or easy to difficult. ChatGPT and Claude and Grok and Gemini and all of them really are brilliant at doing that. But there's no learning involved with that. It's learning a new skill. Yes, prompt engineering. You learn how to not use that saying of garbage in, garbage out. So you learn the better the quality of the question that you ask, the better the output you get from your large language model. But I'm specifically interested in when there is learning involved. Now, my personal field of interest is mathematics. That's what keeps me going every day. It's just the subject, mathematics. But let's throw it out there for all subjects. I'm sure your subjects at school, when you were at school, were probably what? Did you also do mathematics? Did you like mathematics, or did you have a different subject choice? Something that resonated more with you for what you eventually became as a psychologist? Don't know.
Yeah.
Biology, languages.
Yes, biology. I did like English. Yes.
So let's throw it out to something not mathematical, like biology. What is the type of learning that a school child needs to master in the 12 years on the school benches for biology in order to become a psychologist like you? I mean, yes, you need to know how the heart works and the respiratory system and all of that, but try and focus it more into what is the skill behind the learning that a child gets or achieves when doing biology at school. And then we try and broaden that to all subjects. But let's focus maybe, because I get very passionate about my mathematics, so when you let me go, I'm going to talk for hours just about mathematics. So I want to refrain myself a little bit.
I like the word that you're using, mastering, right? And I think this is where AI can make a difference, because as you know, and as I know, we're both educators. It's very difficult to get a student, especially if they're in a class of 20 or 30 students, to master any subject really. And it's a typical bell curve in every single class, and you've probably seen it over the years, that you have your bell curve, you have the majority of your students that do just enough work to get a good enough grade. And most likely, if it's very summative assessment based, it's not skills that they will take away within for the next foreseeable future, right? And then you get, of course, your students that struggle, and you get your students that excel. But it's only that very small proportionate of students that actually master one particular subject. And I think here is where we can really have a look at AI and say, AI can act as a one-to-one tutor if it has a certain set of skills. And it could potentially get a student to actually master something before moving on, where we as normal educators, we can't, because we have not only one student to take care of, we have a number of different students in maybe one class. We've got 50 and we've got 5 classes, etc., etc. And I think that's where AI can make a massive difference. Now, I've seen a lot of AI tutor speculation, talk. With my study in particular, I've also had a look at a number of different AI programs. It is very hard to do because the large language models, you have to set your parameters so it doesn't over support. Like what can happen in the classroom as well, especially if you have, let's say in younger years, you have a teaching assistant. And we've got a teaching assistant network here in Qatar that we support teaching assistants, because one of my big passions when I was in school is looking at the teaching assistants. They make a big difference, but sometimes they also make a big negative difference if they over support. Now, that's sometimes what happens with the large language models. You can find ways to ask a question so it gives you the answer, and that's the problem that we have with that in particular. I haven't seen a lot of really good examples where it can't be overridden, except for Alpha Schools in America. Now, I'm not sure if you're following their story, but their story is quite fascinating and quite good. So Alpha Schools is a school that started recently, and they use AI. They've got a very basic, not a basic tool, but the interface looks very basic, AI interface that teaches, and it focuses on mastery of one particular subject. And the school, how does it work exactly is every single student has their own trajectory. So you could be in grade 4 with maths, but maybe you're in grade 6 with English because you've already mastered English earlier than maths. And I think that's fantastic. Now, I don't know much about the school except for what I've read, and I'm following them for the last few months, and I'm really trying to have a keen eye on it. But it definitely seems like they have started to really innovate a way where we can see what the future of education might look like in a few years.
Okay, so I want to. I normally try and do this at the beginning of the conversation, but I've left it now for the right moment, and I think that's now. I want to, because I do this for every episode. It's just so profound and so important to me in the context of the conversation. It's an article that I came across called "Welcome to the Iron Age of Education." Author by the name of Laurent Joly, if I've got the pronunciation right. The article was published recently on the 23rd of February, and I'm going to read the summary just now, but basically what it comes down to is he's saying that the Iron Age, which we know came after the Bronze Age, won over because iron was just more abundant. Bronze was better. You can actually make better tools and better weapons and better shields and better swords, but ultimately iron won over because it's just so much more abundant. And he makes the case for AI being in the Iron Age of education. So he says, iron did not replace bronze because it was superior. It replaced it because it was abundant. Bronze was powerful but scarce. iron was widely available. And when societies needed scale, abundance changed everything. As we begin today's discussion, or as we're already busy with today's discussion on AI in education, that analogy frames the conversation. The issue is not whether AI replaces great teaching or replaces great teachers, but whether abundant, accessible tutoring can help us address learning gaps at scale in a world where scarcity of support is the real challenge. So that ties in with what you just alluded to, is that, you've got 20 or 30 kids in your class, you've got like 45 minutes maybe in the period. How on earth is a teacher supposed to do anything? And I'm talking about a teacher in a classroom transferring knowledge every day of every period in every subject. How are they supposed to actually get to every single student with pretty much 1.5 minute per child? It's just not possible. They have to
Very good.
throw a blanket over everyone and say, okay, today we're going to do whatever. This is according to the curriculum. This is according to the lesson plan. We are going to do today X. And those who are left behind are just left behind unless they come forward and say, I didn't get this. I didn't understand it. Please help me. Then you start filtering the quality of the teachers and how they support when there are questions. But just the general learning experience starts with a new concept every single day. And that learner, that child has to go back home, do homework, come back tomorrow and do the whole process over again, but with new information. And AI, in my opinion, is so brilliantly positioned to address that problem because it can scale. I said earlier, we've got a million or millions, literally, of these exceptionally powerful, clever people knocking at the front door and say, here I am, use me, use me. But how do we use them? That is where, and I'm very fascinated about alpha schools. I'm simply going to start, look into them as well. But I want to throw another one or another topic over to you for discussion, because what I have found, or what we have found on our side, in our company, is that little key ingredient that's missing from your large language model to what you need to do for an individual child in a scaling exercise revolves around pedagogy. You can't train your normal free large language model. You can't put your guardrails and your parameters around it because it's just going to ignore it. And I know that for a fact in mathematics. If you put a question in mathematics to ChatGPT, it gives you that long answer, but at the end is the answer. There's no tutoring, there's no support, there's no checking along the way. Are you with me? Do you understand what I've just done? Do you have questions? There's nothing of that along the way. Whereas with an agent, that's where the agentic approach comes in. With an agent, which we have our own agent, it's very difficult to do that training, but it's possible. Where you can actually set the parameters and you can get an agent to work within that framework of stop. That is the outcome that I want to get, and you work towards that. The student cannot override that. So what are your thoughts on that idea of pedagogy and using an agent approach rather than just the AI approach?
Yeah, I mean, it will have to be intentional. It will have to be a very much intentionally designed program. And from my perspective, especially if I look at my study and what I've found in the study, it has to be intentional in such a way where it's not only about putting the guardrails in place. I mean, that's the first step, right? Like you say, a large language model, they'll just give you the answer. And if you put some guardrails in place, and I've played with it myself personally, you can ask the question differently. And if maybe by the third time you ask the question, you'll get the answer again. So it has to be designed intentionally, trained intentionally for that. But there's also a few other elements that it needs to consider. I think it's also about looking at cognitive load theory, making sure that it's very seamless, and the interface makes it very easy, and the language is easy enough for the students to also don't have any friction. Because if there's any friction, it will be a failure. So I think it needs to consider the psychological element of it. It needs to embed into the classroom seamlessly. And I also think that it needs to make the teacher's life easier. It needs to lessen their workload. It needs to give them some form of data back. So I think the highlight here, it should be intentionally designed with a few different outcomes, not only one. And then when you have a program or a chatbot or an AI that's intentionally designed and it passes all the tests and psychologically it could be easily adapted, then you need to have a look at how do you embed it into the school, because I don't think it's also just putting it into class and that's how it is. What I like about Alpha is they kind of didn't reintroduce the AI into school. What they did was they redesigned the school day around what they are doing, around the way that they're introducing
Okay.
AI. So
That's
they
bold.
chunked it differently, right? So it looks completely different than a normal school. So they've got like 2 hour slots where a student uses the AI, and then after that, after they've completed the core academics, then they get to do something like focus on a life skill project or entrepreneurship or maybe a fitness or mentorship to go outside. So it's kind of like a work hard and then you also get a reward. And some of the testimonials from the students is they're saying this is the first time ever they've been in a school where they're excited to go to school. They don't like it if it's weekend because school looks different. They're outside, they're learning things. They're going into entrepreneurship, and they're coming back and saying, you know what, I've designed this and I've sold this many products online, and this is now what I'm presenting to the school. So it's takes the whole school day, flips it upside down, creates a kind of holistic development, looking at the transdisciplinary skills that also is really needed, but then having the AI do the hard work of getting them to master the core subjects. So it's kind of like smaller learning pods rather than the traditional classroom. And I think that's really good, right? That's something that also needs to be food for thought if anyone wants to kind of like embed AI. And I think there would be a lot of schools. I mean, we speak to a lot of schools, and generally, like here in the region, there's not a lot of schools that have started to look into how they can integrate AI. And I trust in South Africa, it's the same. I'm not sure, but South Africa is very traditional still in terms of education. So it will be the early adopters that I think reap the rewards, but it's also going to be them that trial and test the way that we can integrate AI. So maybe it's always usually the early adopters that maybe have the ability to sacrifice their time and effort, and then the rest of the people reap the rewards to see what works and what doesn't work. But I think it's definitely a way where education is going to move towards this place. And I think you are right. It's about how to adopt it and how to actually look into what tool to use, but then how to also look into how to redesign the entire school day around that. Because traditional classrooms, let's be honest, I've been an educator for quite some time. I've been a principal of a school. You're an educator for quite some time. Let's be honest, traditional classroom is also not for everyone, right? Not every student will benefit from being in a school where they're sitting in a classroom from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. with 20 other students in that particular classroom. They've got 2 breaks and they have to work towards summative assessments. That model is archaic to some degree and it doesn't work. And, we've seen some of the, let's say, early years where Montessori makes a big difference, and some people are very pro Montessori and some people are very pro, continuous provision and play within early years and the big difference that it could make. So there's some shift in there, but once we get to the secondary school, it looks very traditional still.
I've been thinking about this for a number of years, and I'm not claiming to be a specialist or an expert, but the way I see the traditional school model is it comes from the Victorian era when people were supposed to be trained to be obedient factory workers. You know, you go in when the bell rings and you go home after the bell, and you have to follow orders and you have to be very disciplined, and troublemakers are not tolerated in that environment. So it seems to me, and I mean, you're probably in a much better position to comment on this than me, but it seems as if school was originally designed 200 or 300 years ago to produce such factory workers. You know, it wasn't really supposed to produce anything other than a sausage machine of people in, people out. And I know you've mentioned Montessori, you know, and we can also look at the whole idea of flipped classrooms and blended classrooms. And now we've got the idea of Alpha Schools, which is an AI school. But I'm thinking in my mind, yes, as brilliant as Alpha Schools sounds, and I had a discussion in this week with somebody from an organization called the Leap Institute, where they've got a whole psychological approach to traditional school, really, where they are just trying to make it easy and comfortable for kids in a school classroom, where they're not picked on, you know, they feel valued. All of these are brilliant, but how's AI going to change that? You know, is that just another evolution in the process of technology in education, or is it going to be a revolution like with Alpha Schools, where you actually need to redesign the whole school building, the school system, in order to use the best of AI? And that's where this discussion becomes very important to me, because we have to figure out, I mean, AI is here. You know, whether it's going to get AGI eventually, who knows? But it's such a valuable tool, and it can scale a great teacher. You know, you can scale great teachers using AI, proper training of your agent. You can actually scale very good and very well. How is this going to play out, you know, in the future? Because it doesn't seem like AI really has been solved for education. From where I'm sitting, my exposure, my knowledge, I still think that AI is as brilliant as it is, hasn't really been milked for being a tutor. Let's maybe make a distinction between a teacher and a tutor, where a teacher is the primary person, or the primary responsible person for transferring new knowledge. We're teaching you new things today. But to master that new knowledge, you actually need to go home and you need to do your homework, and you need to master what you heard this morning in the afternoons when you do your homework. And then there's, again, people who complain about homework. You know, homework shouldn't be part of the process. But where does the learning and the mastery come in? And it needs to happen somewhere. I mean, you can't master if you don't practice and expose yourself to the concept and read more and ask questions and so forth. Where in that whole process do you think AI has a future, really?
I'm hopeful, and if I look at Alpha School, and like I said, I really would like to see a bit more about how the actual tool looks like. But if I look at what I've seen from their results, it looks amazing. Because in the States, you have to write SATs, ACTs. So there's some standardized testing that happens. And Alpha Schools has now, in the last year, they've been placed like first from everyone, all the schools. They've placed like the students have scored amazingly high, tremendous. So I think that also is showcasing the value of AI. So I'm hoping that other people would start to see that, adapt it accordingly, but also not just adapt it half-heartedly. That's the problem with most schools. Like, I've been in schools where I can see some people are on board with adapting a really good idea, but usually what happens, if it's not completely adapted and supported by everyone, then it either just goes away or it's not adapted well enough to make a difference. So for me, I do think that the question lies in how well are you going to adopt it? Not adopt it half-heartedly. You have to fully look at how you're going to adopt it and also adopt the school day surround that. And I like what you said about the LEAP Foundation, if I remember that the name correctly, looking at the psychological, like the psychological side of it. And for me also, of course, that's really important. And I would say this, at the previous school where I was the principal, the British Academy, we had a really strong way of looking at okay, how can we psychologically make sure we do the best for our students? The school is adopted in an amazing way, actually. It's very much very small classes, so you get a lot of individual attention. So I'll give you an example. The standard class size is about 7 students. So it ranges from about 7 to 12, 14. So you get a lot of individual attention. There's a big push on a community of belonging. So creating that sense of belonging within the school, a lot of assemblies, working on kind of the school culture, and with great success. I'll say, not only because I was there for 2 years and I was the principal, but even when I entered, right before I became the principal, it was already there. It was an amazing, fantastic school culture. Now, you can have that. You can have psychological safety. You can have a fantastic school culture. You can have a culture of belonging. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, yes, it's going to have a great effect on the learning, but it's not going to mean that there's still, all students are going to score A or, A star in A levels or AS levels if you look at Cambridge. Not all students are going to score 90%, 80%. They're still going to have a big focus on certain students, and it's going to be a bell curve like everything else. You can't control that, because even if you only have 7 students, you still have 7 students of one class. Maybe you have 3 classes, you've got 21 students. You can't get everyone to master where AI can. So I'm hoping for the revolution. I'm hoping that first and foremostly is going to be driven by school leaders, innovative school leaders that have the courage to say, you know what, this is something we have. This is something we need to look at, because the world is evolving, and as you say, it's very much like the Iron Age, right? Because the level of how AI has grown since it started, and since we all got customized with ChatGPT in 2022 up until now, and the level of uptake and the amount of people that started to use it, it's far above anything we've ever seen before. So clearly the world is moving towards that. Big firms like McKinsey's and Deloitte, they're using it, right? Everyone is using it, let's be honest. So how can we not have it in schools? We have to have it in schools. We have to teach how to use it responsibly, but we also have to use it in order to get the students and have the biggest impact possible for the students. Because school should be student-centered. We should have a look at that. And we have to have a look at, okay, how can we use this to make a difference? And I think that's where the magic is going to be. It's in that small space of.
Here's a question for you. If a child says, you know what, I'm in school, I'm grade 7, I'm grade 9, anywhere in the process of schooling, I don't really need to master anything because I can master it on the fly with AI. What would you say to that objection? You being a qualified psychologist, I mean, would you be able to be a qualified psychologist if all you did was use AI? Let's say you were now a first-year student, with the current AI that is available. Would you be able to become a surgeon, an engineer, a psychologist, any professional person that is not necessarily threatened by AI taking over your job, because there is a certain level of humanness still required? If a child says, you know what, I don't really need to worry, I'll figure it out as I go along because I've got ChatGPT on my phone. What do you say to such a child?
Well, that probably will happen, and I think it's a good point, because yes, ChatGPT will give you the answers, but you have to be able to interpret whether it's correct or not. You have to be able to also use it and adapt it accordingly. So the very short answer to that is no. You can't become a surgeon with only ChatGPT. I'm sure surgeons are using it. I'm sure the doctor is like, I'll be right back, and they go into the back and have a look at what medicine to prescribe. I'm quite certain that happens. However, I do think that it's going to help you and maybe give you some guidance, but you're not going to be an expert on the subject. ChatGPT is still the expert on the subject, and I think this also pertains to the importance of the human touch, especially in early years, because as good as AI might be in Alpha School, let's say, for example, as one example that works at the minute, in secondary schools and maybe in primary schools, in early years, that's not going to be the case. You're still going to have a teacher, hands-on, teaching you how to draw, teaching you how to write your name, teaching you phonics, teaching you all of that, teaching you how to play, and teaching your basic numbers and all of that. So in early years, I mean, the teachers will always have, the importance will always be the teacher. And from my experience, I've always seen the most passionate teachers in early years, because I do think that, the fundamentals is the most important.
But I mean, let's take it further to high school. Let's take it to university level. You will always need a good teacher, not true?
Yes, true. You
Okay,
always
so
have to have someone
yeah,
as the expert. Yes.
yes. So I heard the saying the other day, and I mean, it's an adaptation of something that has been floating around for a long time, is that AI is not going to replace the teacher. Teachers with AI will replace teachers.
That's
What do you
such a
make
good
of
saying.
that?
That's an amazing saying. That is so accurate, and I think therein lies the problem, because part of my study is also having a look at measuring the anxiety that teachers and students alike have about adapting or introducing AI in education. And teachers have quite a high level of anxiety regarding this, because they feel like they'll be replaced. They do feel like, even though they've worked for X amount of years, everyone knows how clever ChatGPT could be. Not that it's always right. I've seen it make a lot of mistakes, and I had that conversation with ChatGPT before, and it will apologize profusely. But they feel that way, and they feel like this might, this might also impede on the level of control I have within my own class. So I do think that there's a certain level of anxiety, especially right now, before it's being majorly adopted. I think it's that time of uncertainty, and as we all know, uncertainty breeds a bit of anxiety. So I think it's about going back to, it needs to be leaders first, innovative leaders that will have the courage to say, yes, we need to adopt it. But then they'll have to get the buy-in from the staff, the teachers. And they'll have to be able to communicate what exactly do they want. And it has to be also done in such a way where it makes it easier for the teacher, it reduces their workload, and also it doesn't impede in their own way of delivering the curriculum, let's say, but it enhances it rather.
So you have been a principal in a school in South Africa, but I mean, it could have been anywhere in the world for that matter. What do you think is the major cause of the anxiety around AI? Is it the resistance to change, which typically happens with people? I mean, it could have been going from chalkboard to electronic whiteboards. No AI, just a change in the way it has been done for 500 years. Or is it really about AI taking my job? What is the biggest objection that you would say from your experience as a principal? Let's say you are still a principal, hypothetically. You decide you're going to be one of those innovative leaders. You are going to make your school like Alpha Schools. Where are you going to find the biggest resistance as a school leader?
I love this topic, because this is, I think, one of my favorite topics, because this is what we do in schools as well. We help with the change management because, yes, this is a big change. But like anything else in school, if you introduce a change within the setting, and this could be school, this could be business or anything like that, and this is where the occupational psychology comes in. You have to manage the change accordingly because, and I know this personally because I've stood in front of the teachers, and not only as principal, but previously as a Senko or previously as a school leader, I'll be standing there and saying, right guys, this is what is going to happen now. We have to make this change based upon, let's say, the Department of Education has implemented this. You can say whatever. You'll always have people that don't like change. People don't like change in general. Think of you and me, for example, right? We don't like change in our structure. Structure gives us a certain set of safety. I'm right now in the Gulf region where there's some regional tension, and I can see the underlying tension in everyone's faces wherever I go. Even though the country where I'm stationed at, they're doing a fantastic, amazing job. Everything is under control. Regardless, it's the uneasiness of the potential changes in our day. You know what? You can't. Let's everyone do a bit of online learning at the minute. It already kind of disrupts. It's it's very hard for us to adapt. So, as a school leader, if you go to a school and you look at your staff and you say, right, we're going to have a look at the, let's say, for example, teaching and learning framework. We're going to change the teaching and learning framework, or we're going to have a look at observation cycle. This is when the observation cycle is going to happen, A, B, C, and D, or we're going to have A, B, C, whatever the case may be. You'll have your resistors. Some people will resist, go around speaking to other teachers about the unhappiness about it. You'll have your early adopters, and then you'll have your general staff that wants to see, but they're kind of like in between, those two. So you'll have to do it in a way where, number one, you get early buy-in. Like any change management in any company, you'll have to identify your early adopters and also get them to drive the change within the company or within the school. And then you'll have to make sure that they're also happy, get the input. This is something that I learned when I was a principal. That's really important. And luckily, I had the psychological foundation. As a psychologist, I'm very much of the opinion that you have to lead by example, but you also have to give them a certain input. They have to also be able to voice how they feel, even though sometimes we can't change it, but sometimes we can listen. So if I had anything that I had to provide the staff to say, this is what we're going to do, I would say, okay, this is what's going to happen. This is what we need to do. I would like your input. I would like your feedback on this particular situation. Let's say, for example, is observation. How do you feel about A, B, C, and D? Then they can have the input. And then I can look at it. I can present the group's input back to them. Again, questions and answers. And eventually we'll get to a place where people now felt like, number one, they've been heard. Number two, that they had an input because maybe I'll change something around, or maybe I'll give them peer observations to help them feel a bit more comfortable before we have the leadership observations. Or maybe we'll do some learning walks that's a bit more supportive. However the case may be, they feel like they had an input in it, and then automatically you have the buy-in. It's much easier to then move forward with the change and also drive the change all the way through. So I think that's this case with something as big as this, because this is not only one particular element. This might change the entire structure of the delivery, structure of the teaching and learning framework, maybe the entire day, to be fair. So it has to have a lot of buy-in and also a lot of input from teachers on how does it look, how does it work, will this be effective, will this make my life easier, and will I be replaced, yes or no? You have to answer those hard questions immediately. Get from the get-go, say, this is how it is, guys. This is not going to replace you. We're not going to get rid of you once you've successfully adapted this into school.
Yeah, but I think just to answer that question about why teachers won't be replaced, I want to put something on out there to say where the need is. I mean, yes, we do realize that there are not enough teachers. You know, as it stands, currently we have a shortage of teachers. I know in South Africa, but I'm assuming in the rest of the world there is a shortage of teachers because you can just look at the ratio of teacher to learners. You know, it's always very high, except in very special schools where they manage to get the ratio lower. But where I have found, and this is coming from a mathematical perspective, I have found a huge need or a huge gap in after school support for questions. You know, it's like, yes, I've taught you now, go and do your homework. And I'm not knocking homework, please. This is important for the viewers. You know, ultimately, don't comment in the or on the video and say, yeah, Gerrie is knocking homework. It's just an example that I use because that is where the mastery of whatever I heard this morning takes place. Can I do the questions? The assessments that you do later, your formal assessments, is a test. Whether you can memorize, whether you actually have mastered it, whether you can adapt, you know, the questions and still interpret. But just mastering what I heard this morning needs to happen this afternoon. And there is no support. So when we look at the concept that has been going for ages of extra classes, does it really help? You know, is it supporting to have once a week extra class? You already have 5 classes every week. Having a 6th class, is that really fixing the problem by just throwing an extra amount of money from the parents or an extra amount of hours from an extra class teacher? Does it really help? And in answering that question, I want to take us back in our minds to the days of the old Greeks, Plato and Aristotle and Pythagoras. How did teaching happen? Now, my perspective is that they sat around the town square and they just talked. It's peer discussions, you know. They basically just threw ideas around, and your teacher would be the person who ultimately steers the conversation maybe or makes a final call, but learning wasn't being taught. Learning was being participating in the whole process. And then obviously in the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, this whole thing just fell flat. Nobody had the opportunity to learn to read and write anymore. And then after the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages, it seems like the Victorian era of school, which we still use, came to be, where you now suddenly have this one-to-many approach. One teacher, many students. But where are we going with this? Are we sticking with that model, trying to make it better? Or are we trying to say to teachers and students that maybe it's either time for a third change in this whole cycle, or do we go back to discussions like it was before? Or how do we adapt to AI? And I want to stress that I don't think AI is going to go away. You know, it's here to stay. So we better learn to how to work with it rather than against it. And I think that's the biggest fear of teachers, really, is that the students are not working with the AI as such in learning. They are working with the AI to not learn, because the AI will do everything for you. You know, if you ask it to do something, it will do it for you. No objections. What are your feelings from the let's call it the Nostradamus point of view? Where are we, you know, if you had to throw something out for 10 or 15 years from now, where will school be?
I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that the change that needs to happen happens. Um, I agree with you. I think there should be this change, the third wave, let's say. And I think the reason for that is the students that we're teaching. If you've been a teacher for a minute, you've seen how they change and how they change in the way that they learn. They're very clever, to be honest. Even the students that are quite young, they'll come in, they'll tell you things that you've maybe never heard in your life, to be fair, because they learn in a different way. They learn online and they learn in shorter chunks, and they retain information if they engage in it. And I mean, look at something like the most played game in the world, Minecraft. It's maybe for me and you that we laymen in it, we don't understand it. We have a look at it, but some of those kids have built entire worlds, and it's incredible, to be honest with you. And I've had some students personally that would show what they've done. It's a different way of learning completely. Yeah. So if the students are learning differently, but we stay the same, then where is the problem here? We can't just stay the same. We have to adapt. Technology is evolving. The world is evolving around us. We can't teach the sage on the stage